On this episode of Newt's World, strong families are the cornerstone of strong communities that go on to build a stronger nation as a whole. Unfortunately, widespread divorce rates, the erosion of traditional marriage, the popular rise of radical ideologies, attacks on faith and government interference in our daily lives are resulting in a breakdown of the family, robbing us of the country we love. Dr. Ben Carson says it doesn't have to be this way. In his new book, The Perilous Fight, Overcoming Our Culture's War on the American Family, Dr. Carson offers inspiration and the answers needed to restore the family as America's key foundation. Like many, Dr. Carson fears we are losing the country we love and encourages readers to return to the biblical and familial values on which our country was founded. So I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, Dr. Ben Carson. He is a best-selling author, the former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, a 2016 Republican presidential candidate, the former Director of Pediatric Neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins, founder and chairman of the American Cornerstone Institute, and Callista and I regard both Ben and his wife Candy as very good personal friends and people we admire very much. Ben, welcome, and thank you for joining me again on Newt's World.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for continuing to be a voice of courage and logic out there.
I've always been stunned by your comprehension of what people need to learn. Ever since I first heard you as a much younger man, I had a prayer of a breakfast in Washington, D.C., where you were so remarkable that from that date to this, I've never forgotten just how brilliant you are.
Oh, well, thank you. It's been a very interesting life, I must admit. But the thing that really concerns me, I worked very hard as a pediatric neurosurgeon for a very long time. And I looked so forward to retiring and playing golf and just cruising around the world, having a good time. But things have deteriorated to the point I wouldn't be able to enjoy myself on the golf course, watching us disintegrate. So we have to stay engaged, remembering all those people who came before us and what they were able to do and the sacrifices that they made.
You're also remarkable at every level. I mean, you were a world-class pioneer in pediatric surgery. I thought you were a very effective presidential candidate in 2016. You were a very important, passionate, pioneering Secretary of Housing and Urban Development who really worked hard to help us do a better job of helping poor Americans have decent housing. You created Cornerstone to teach people, and I remember fondly Callista and I being with you and with Candy at an event at Mount Vernon, and your depth of patriotism is remarkable. And yet, all of it goes back to your mother. Could you just take a minute or two, because you've talked about a number of cases, but it seems to me that both you and your brother Curtis were profoundly influenced by your mom.
Well, we absolutely were. She's the wisest person that I ever knew. Didn't have much in the way of education. She came from a huge rural family in Tennessee, shifted from home to home, never really had a stable location, achieved less than a third grade education, and got married at age 13, hoping to escape dire poverty and hoping for some opportunity. And she and my father moved to Detroit, where he was a factory worker and a part-time preacher. But she, years later, discovered he was also a bigamist, had another family, so that resulted in a divorce. And she was left with the task of trying to raise two young sons by herself in the inner city. But she was never a person who would give up easily. And we moved in with some relatives in Boston in a very typical tenement, multifamily dwelling, sirens and gangs, and murders. Both of my older cousins who we adored were killed. That's the kind of stuff that I saw as a kid. And I really never expected myself to live beyond the age of 20, 25 at the most. Obviously, things changed And a lot of that was due to my mother. She worked 2 or 3 jobs at a time as a domestic because she didn't want to be on welfare. She didn't want to be dependent on the government. And she would leave at 5 in the morning, get home at midnight, job after job, but always looking after us. But she was very concerned that we were doing poorly academically. And she said, "You're going to wind up the same way as I am. You've got to become educated." And after careful prayer, she came up with the idea of turning off the TV and making us read books and submit to her written book reports, which she couldn't read, but we didn't know that. And in the process of reading all those books about scientists and explorers and entrepreneurs, I began to realize that the person who had the most to do with what happened to you is you. I stopped listening to all those people who were saying, "You can't do this. This society is stacked against you. There's a bunch of racist people." I just put all that stuff in the garbage and started focusing on what I could do. And, I went from a terrible student to a top student. Same thing happened with my brother. I always say if everybody had my mother, we wouldn't have any problem.
We've never talked about it. How has Curtis's life been?
Curtis went into the Navy because at that time in our lives, they had the lottery system to see who was going into the military service because the Vietnam War was still going on. I got a very high number, like 333, but he got a low number, like 14. So he said, well, they're going to take me, so I may as well go where I want to go. And he went to the nuclear atomic submarine program and was doing very well with that, but then decided that he would prefer mechanical engineering. So when he got out of the Navy, he enrolled in a mechanical engineering major at the University of Michigan and finished that. Did some advanced degree work. Ended up working as an aeronautical engineer. So I always say I became the brain surgeon and he became the rocket scientist.
Here's your mother, who in traditional liberal terms would have been a figure of despair. And she raises 2 sons who go to Michigan and Yale and end up being remarkably successful people. So there is hope that people can, in fact, grow and learn.
And I encourage young mothers all the time not to think about what you can't do, but to think about what you can do. When you think about the human brain and the potential of the human brain, what it can do, it remembers everything you've ever seen, everything you've ever heard, can process more than 2 million bits of information per second. You can't overload it. And it's like a computer. And if you program it the right way, it does amazing things. And if you don't put anything in there, you're not going to get anything out.
In terms of your own success, you have a great story about your Uncle William and cars. And again, it's an example that life is a motion picture. It's not a snapshot. It's a trajectory. And if you get on the right trajectory, things happen. But tell us just for a minute about this 2-car relationship with Uncle William.
After the divorce, we moved in with relatives in Boston, Uncle William and Aunt Jean. He worked in the meatpacking factory. He was one of the hardest workers you ever saw. Worked not only the regular shift, but worked any overtime that he could get to try to keep a roof over our head and food on the table. And when I graduated from Yale, he was so proud of me, and he bought me a car. It was a 1968 Pontiac Le Mans. And that car broke down on a regular basis. I learned a lot about mechanics of cars back in those days. But years later, he was visiting us, he and Aunt Jean, and I had recently bought a new Lincoln Continental. And he just fell in love with that car. He just loved it so much that I signed it over to him and gave him the keys. And I said, Uncle Williams, this is your car. And he loved that car so much, he slept in it.
Now, that's getting repaid with interest.
But I just was so grateful for, what they had done for us when basically we were homeless. And, he really cared for us. And he was a very kind man who worked very hard and was an excellent role model.
Well, when you talk about role models, in your new book, The Perilous Fight, Overcoming Our Culture's War on the American Family, you make a point that I think is so direct and yet so frustrating, that there are 3 simple steps that if we could get most American teenagers to understand them, they would never be in poverty. We'll talk a little bit about the 3 steps that make a difference in your future.
This was a study that was actually initially carried out by the Brookings Institute. And they're not particularly conservative, to say the least. But they discovered that if a person finished high school, got married, and wait until they're married to have children, the likelihood of them living in poverty is 2% or less, which is, of course, much less than what we see in the general population. That shouldn't be news anymore, but it is. There was a time in our nation when that wasn't news. People knew you had to get an education. They knew you had to get married, form a family. They knew that you didn't have babies out of wedlock because that was a disadvantage to the baby, much less a disadvantage to you. And they knew that working hard was not a bad thing, it was a good thing. And those are the kind of values that frequently are passed on through the family. So when you have the dissolution of the traditional nuclear family, you're not getting those kinds of values passed on. And you think back to some of the statistics. Children who come from broken homes are 2.3 times as likely to be homeless. Think about that. And they're twice as likely to get in trouble with the police or end up in jail, twice as likely to experience educational underachievement, to experience alcoholism, drug abuse, teen pregnancy. All of these things are things that come from family values. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is that you learn a lot about your family history, but also you have somebody emphasizing your learning process. Our history is the basis of our identity, which is the basis of our beliefs. So if you break that chain, what happens to the individual? They become like a leaf blowing in the wind with no anchor. That's what's happening to all these children, these young people that we see at the universities, who are easily being incorporated by the philosophies of Hamas, which is terrorism and hatred, and they're easy victims for something like that. Somebody who has a solid family foundation, not going to do that.
Well, I was talking over the weekend with a professor at Duke who helped design the Singapore health system, which is remarkably effective and for about 5% of the GDP produces a better outcome than we do at 18%. But he said one of the keys was that they understand the cultural framework within which health occurs. And so they spend a lot of time and effort communicating with people. And it occurred to me that these 3 simple principles which you mentioned, complete at least a high school education, get a full-time job, wait until after marriage to have children. If we had some kind of national effort that made sure that by 6th grade, every young person knew these 3 rules, you'd have a different country in one generation.
You would, but of course we would have the left saying, you can't do that. That is inappropriate, and they would try to outlaw it immediately.
But that is what the fight's about.
It is, I know. What we have to do is stay in the fight and put the facts on the table. Sometimes we get into a fight with them, and it's just ideology against ideology. But we have to take the facts and put them on the center of the table and work around those. And then keep in mind that you can take the most radical left-wing person and the most radical right-wing person, and they're going to agree on 80% of stuff. But we allow that 20% to be the troublemaker. And we allow the media to stir up all of this dissension. which I guess benefits them because people want to see what they have to say. But they're not looking long-term. They're not looking long-term at what is happening to our country. And if they know their history, they can see that Marxist ideologies are taking over in our country. And what happens when you have a Marxist government? What happens to the media? They immediately are completely controlled. So they're digging their own grave and they don't even know it.
One of the things I'm most struck with is that on the one hand, you have this very scientific background. At the same time, with all this huge scientific knowledge that you have, you come back and focus on the Bible as a manual for life and the degree to which we should be looking at the Creator in order to understand the wisdom to have a healthy society and a healthy life. How do you integrate those two worlds? You clearly do it brilliantly, and I'm just curious how you do it.
For me, it's just logic and common sense. You know, a few weeks ago, we were all marveling at the eclipse. But think about it. We know that there's not going to be another eclipse like that for 20 years. How would that be possible if the universe was random? Those are the kinds of things that let me know that there is a God. I look at how complex the human brain is. If, in order for something like that to evolve through the process of natural selection, you would have to have millions of consecutive right things done, not random things done. That's virtually impossible. Like flipping a coin and 1,000,000 times it comes up heads. That's not going to happen. So I let the logic inform me. But also, you think back on our country and our founders. They were men who believed in God. A lot of people like to say, no, they were deists. They just believed there was a God, but he didn't intervene in any way. That used not to be in our textbooks. Our history books used to talk about the bulletproof George Washington, who was a courier for General Braddock in the French and Indian War, was shot many times. Nothing ever happened to him. He had 4 bullet holes in his coat. He had bullet fragments in his hair, but he had no wounds. And years later, one of the Indian chiefs saw him and said, I just wanted to meet you before I died because I am an expert marksman and I shot you many times. And my men shot you many times. And pretty soon I told them to stop shooting at you. I said, this is the man who's protected by the Great Spirit above. That used to be in the history books that our children learned from. But you know what happened in 1963? The Supreme Court said, sorry, no Bibles, no prayer in school. And all the schools took down the 10 Commandments. And I have to ask, what exactly is wrong with thou shalt not kill, and thou shalt not steal, and thou shalt not envy, and all these things? And no one has ever given me a satisfactory answer as to what's wrong with those things, because there is nothing wrong with those things. And now we have people talking about your truth versus my truth, instead of talking about the truth. And our founders based our whole Constitution and our way of living on God's Word. John Adams, our second president, said, our Constitution is designed for a moral and religious people and is wholly inadequate for the government of any other. And unfortunately, that's what's going on right now in this country. We have people who are not moral, who are not religious. People like the judge in the Trump case in New York, who has clear-cut conflict of interest and won't recuse himself. And there seems to be no mechanism to deal with people who are not moral. So we got a problem.
Well, what do you think has led to this assault? I'm old enough that I grew up in America that sort of had a very common sense and patriotic feel for its history, for the Constitution, for the Founding Fathers. And I've watched over my lifetime this endless hostility, particularly in the universities and now driven all the way down into the K through 12. But what do you think drives this kind of anti-American and anti-religious hostility?
Don't think that I'm a conspiracy theorist, but I believe there are a group of people who want a one-world government. And what stands in the way? The United States of America and the system that we have. And we can't be overcome because we're too strong militarily. You can only be destroyed from within. A house divided against itself cannot stand. And therefore, a great deal of effort is being employed to destroy the harmony, the sense of community in our country, and the basic building blocks of our communities. That would include our faith and our families. And this attack has been going on for a while. I think I mentioned to you before the congressional record, January the 10th, 1963, when Congressman Herlong of Florida read into the record the 45 goals of communists in America. And unfortunately, many of them have been accomplished. They include things like gaining control of the school system and the teacher unions so you can indoctrinate the kids. It includes fomenting rioting amongst our young college kids and getting control of their newspapers and indoctrinating them. It includes making aberrant sex normal, natural, and healthy, to infect our very core, our very moral core in our country. And it's working. That's the problem. It's working very effectively. And that's, I think, the reason that Khrushchev said to Eisenhower more than 60 years ago, your grandchildren's children will live under our system. He knew what he was talking about because it erode our system from within.
Process of this effort to dissolve traditional America, literally, which has grown particularly, I think, through the colleges and universities, and now through the teachers' unions. We have a project that you know about called America's New Majority Project, where we have been doing a lot of polling and a lot of trying to understand where the American people are. And 84% of the American people believe parents have the right to know what's happening to their children in classrooms. 84%. And yet the teachers' unions are bitterly opposed and use their muscle. They spend about $5 billion a year on politics, and they use their muscle to try to get state legislatures to block parents from being able to learn. This is the kind of aggressive radicalism which, it seems to me, requires the kind of effort you and others are putting into it. And in a sense, is at the very heart of what your book is warning about, that we have to reestablish certain core values or the whole system collapses. Is that about right?
That's exactly right. And think about a child and a child's brain. At conception, the brain starts developing. Millions of neurons every single day. By the time a baby is born, it is still developing at a rapid rate. That's why a newborn baby sleeps 20 to 22 hours a day. It continues to develop into their mid to late 20s. So when you're talking about a child, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, making radical decisions about their gender and what should be done with their bodies, that is craziness. You're dealing with somebody who has an underdeveloped brain, who's naturally curious, who's very suggestible. That's the reason that God gave kids parents, to protect them during that time of vulnerability. And we're allowing people to take advantage of it in a very cruel way, which leaves a large number of these children in very desperate situations.
One of the things you have advocated is that ultimately parents who really care about these values may either have to have school choice or have homeschooling, because it may not be possible to beat the teachers' unions inside their core institutions. How important do you think school choice is in that sense?
I've been going to a lot of school choice organizations and talking with them and homeschooling. And it is proliferating at a very rapid rate. Homeschooling has more than doubled since 2020. Many of the private schools have waiting lists that are years long now, people trying to get in. That tells you that the American people know what's happening. COVID did us a favor in terms of opening a window so we could see what was being done to indoctrinate the kids. And people don't want that for their kids. They want them to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. They want them to know the basics of life so that they can function successfully. And one of the things that happens before nations go Marxist is that they dumb down the population. And you can see that happening in our population. You go on the street and these on-the-street interviews and you ask people, who was the first president of the United States? They don't know. They don't know what countries touch on the United States. They don't know how many Supreme Court justices there are. They don't know what the three branches of government are. They don't know anything. And when you have people like that, they become very easy to lead. And that's what you need, to go from a system of freedom and prosperity like we have to a system that people like Stalin had. You have to have people who don't think for themselves.
So you have yourself directly been engaged in trying to offset this and creating the American Cornerstone Institute, which has a program that we've helped with called Little Patriots, which people can find at littlepatriotslearning.com. Talk for just a minute about what inspired this and what you hope to achieve with the Little Patriots program.
Well, seeing how the children were being indoctrinated, we call this the inoculation to indoctrination. They need to know who we are, and we can't be shamed about it. We have to boldly go in there and proclaim who we are, teach our children all of our history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But of course, there's a heck of a lot more good than there is bad and ugly. And what we've done is sort of stood in the background and let the people who like to emphasize bad and ugly, CRT, 1619 program people, take the reins and go into our schools and go into the superintendent's office and propagate this garbage with no opposition. So we want to oppose that. We've been very fortunate to have a lot of very philanthropic people join the program and underwrite the cost of it so that we can provide it 100% free of charge to everybody, because these are things that need to be known not only by elite people who can afford them, they need to be known by everybody. And we have to do everything we can to disseminate that information.
Well, I mean, the Little Patriots Learning Program, which I think I've read every single script, is very, very impressive introduction to American history. But now you've also gone and developed a brand new Executive Branch for America program at the American Cornerstone Institute. What was your reasoning in creating Executive Branch for America?
Well, because there are 4 million people who work in the executive branch of government. And when a new president comes in, he gets to change 3,000 of them. That's a drop in the bucket. And unfortunately, because all of our agencies tend to be concentrated in the D.C. area, we tend to get an overabundance of people who are philosophically inclined to agree with the D.C. type of mentality, which is generally pretty left-wing. If we're going to salvage this country, we need to have a lot of people come in, not only during political seasons as political appointees, but as career appointees who have a conservative bent, so that we can help right the ship. It's leaning way, way, way over to the left. It's going to sink if we don't do something about that. We need to get people in there on the right side of the ship, and they need to be there for long periods of time. Because, as you know better than anybody, the people who really do the work are the staffers. And they're the ones who do the research, and if you have the right people there, they can push the programs through very effectively. And if you have the wrong people there, they can stall your programs, and they can say, you're only going to be here for 4 years. We can outlast you. And many of them have been there for 20, 30, 40. We even had some people who had been there for 50 years at HUD.
I love your positive, optimistic approach. And I also have to say, having had the remarkable opportunity to get to know both you and your wife, Candy, personally, you are such profound citizens. And you've co-founded the Carson Scholars Fund, which recognizes young people of all backgrounds for exceptional academic and humanitarian achievements. What was your reasoning in creating the Carson Scholars Fund?
Well, I would go into schools. I did a lot of speaking in schools. And the first thing I would see as I entered the school were all these trophies. All-state wrestling, all-state football, all-state basketball. What about the academic superstar? What did they get? A National Honor Society pin and a pat on the head. They're their little nerd. And nobody really gave them any love. And we said, if we want to encourage this, we need to honor these young people. We started giving out scholarships to students starting in the 4th grade for superior academic achievement and demonstration of humanitarian qualities. Because we are trying to develop the future leaders of our country. We need people who are not only smart, but people who care about other people. It's so important. Napoleon was smart. The Marquis de Sade was smart. Hitler was smart. But they didn't care about other people. And it makes all the difference in the world. And we've been having the banquets. We have 6 banquets around the country. We have one coming up in the Baltimore, Washington area. And we always have adult honorees as well, the people who are good role models. The one for Baltimore this year is Cal Ripken, who demonstrated incredible tenacity, the Iron Man of baseball. And last weekend we had Tony Orlando in Naples, Florida area, because he was a man who dedicated himself to the veterans, raised over $175 million for veteran causes, and used his celebrity in a very positive way. And that's what we want these children to do. And you should see their faces, when they march in and the music is playing Procession of the Nobles and the lights are shining on them. And they're being recognized very much like the sports stars. And I don't have anything against sports and entertainment, don't get me wrong. It's just that we have to show some love to the people who do a lot in our society.
You're really a remarkable person. You were an absolute pioneer, a world-level pioneer in pediatric neurosurgery. You are a presidential candidate, a cabinet officer, an inventor of programs committed to patriotism and to getting this country back in the right direction, the author of books. You had a terrific movie about you and Candy called Gifted Hands, which I've had the really interesting experience. Plus, then I got to actually watch it with the two of you. And I can testify that the movie is really worth seeing, and you will be awestruck by what the Carsons are like. And the thing I think I admire most is you continue as a citizen. This is something I wish I get across to everybody who listens to us. One of the great challenges of being an American is you have to be a citizen all your life. You're not allowed to retire. You're not allowed to go on vacation. You are a citizen, and it takes a lot of citizens to offset those who would harm us as a country.
Well, especially right now with things that are going on, citizens have to recognize that our founders knew that we would get to a point like this. And they put the power to change it in the hands of citizens, in the hands of the people, through the vote. But it means you have to use that power appropriately. And most people, when they go into the voting booth, they just look for the name that looks familiar. That's all. I mean, it could be Satan. Yep, I know that one. That's the one they check off. That's no good. That's not exercising your citizenship appropriately. And you don't have to stand for unreasonable things. When you go to be a polling place watcher and they say, you can watch, but you got to watch from way over there on the other side where you can't see what's going on. No, you don't. Don't listen to that garbage. Or they say the signatures don't have to match. Yes, they do have to match. Or you can have 1,000 ballots that come from the same address. No, you cannot. And yes, people have to have voter ID. We have to insist on these things. These are things that make perfectly good sense. They're just logical, common sense things.
And of course, the problem is they all weaken the ability of the machine to rig the election. So they actually return you to honest elections. Well, listen, I want to thank you for joining me. Your new book, The Perilous Fight, Overcoming Our Culture's War on the American Family, is available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. I think it's an incredibly important book. You are a remarkable American. Everyone should read it and should listen to you on a regular basis. And I want to encourage listeners who'd like to learn more to visit the American Cornerstone website at americancornerstone.org. They're going to be very impressed with what you're doing to help save this country.
And you're helping us, and you've been there from the beginning, and we appreciate you. Thank you for being a patriot.
Thank you to my guest, Dr. Ben Carson. You can get a link to buy his new book, The Perilous Fight, Overcoming Our Culture's War on the American Family, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.